In the sweltering heat of late August 1945, a convoy of trucks rumbled through the dusty roads of Japan's countryside, carrying an unexpected cargo, captured female soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their faces, gaunt and weary from months of captivity, betrayed a sense of resignation. They had been prisoners of war for nearly 6 months now, held by the Allies after the defeat of Japan in the Pacific. Each woman aboard that truck carried the weight of not only the war but also the expectations of what awaited them behind barbed wire. For them, the very concept of surrender was anathema. The brutal training they had endured as auxiliaries of the Imperial Army taught them that there were only two outcomes for a soldier: victory or death. No middle ground. The idea of being taken prisoner was a disgrace, and now that the war was over, the women expected nothing less than severe punishment. The U.S. forces had a reputation for harsh retribution against those who had fought so fiercely, and in the minds of these Japanese prisoners, the horrors of defeat were a fate worse than death. But the reality of their situation was about to prove more surreal than they could have imagined. The trucks pulled into a U.S. military detention camp in Okinawa, a place they had been prepared to endure for the harsh interrogations and threats they had heard whispered during their months in the field. As they disembarked, their eyes met the cold, unforgiving walls of the compound. Expecting to face the wrath of the victors, many of the women began to brace for the worst. The smell of freshly cut grass, the routine clatter of American military equipment, and the low murmur of soldiers' voices filled the air. But as the women shuffled forward, something strange began to unfold. They were led not to cells, not to interrogation rooms, but to a series of long wooden tables covered with ice cream. The scene was so absurd, it took a moment for it to sink in. A small group of American soldiers, nonchalant and cheerful, were serving the women large bowls of ice cream, the kind they had never seen, chilled, creamy, and topped with chocolate syrup. The shock was palpable. At first, the prisoners could not believe their eyes. There were no shackles, no cold stares. Only Americans, smiling, handing out food. The women hesitated. Was this a cruel joke? A trap? But their hunger and exhaustion overcame their fear, and one by one, they took the bowls. The ice cream tasted like nothing they had ever known, sweet, cold, and rich. In a war where food was often scarce, where meals were simple and often meager, this was an indulgence they had never imagined in their wildest dreams. Some of the women cried. Others simply stared, bewildered. They were prisoners, after all. They had been trained to expect a swift, brutal justice. And yet, here they were, receiving not punishment, but an act of kindness, a gesture so far removed from their expectations that it nearly broke their minds. Was this mercy? Was this mockery? One of the women, a former radio operator named Hoshiko, later recalled the scene in her diary. I thought the Americans were making fun of us. How could they feed us so well after all we had done, after all the pain we caused them? Hoshiko, along with many others, was consumed with guilt. They had fought in a war of aggression, one that had torn through the Pacific, leaving destruction in its wake. How could they sit, in defeat, accepting such kindness? As days passed, the camp became a place of strange routines. The women were given regular meals, baths, and medical treatment. They were allowed to sit in the shade, listen to music, and even write letters to their families. The Americans treated them not as prisoners, but as people, albeit defeated people. For the first time in their lives, the women who had once been part of the imperial military machine began to feel a sense of relief, even gratitude. The contrast was stark. During the war, Japanese soldiers had been taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. The infamous orders from Emperor Hirohito, demanding that the nation never yield, had shaped their worldviews since childhood. To be a POW was the ultimate failure, a fate worse than death. But now, here they were, given not only sustenance but kindness. Something completely unexpected from their captors. At first, the American soldiers themselves were unsure of what to make of this strange turn of events. Many had grown up hearing the bitter propaganda about the Japanese, portraying them as a relentless enemy to be beaten into submission. But as they saw the women, their haggard faces and trembling hands, some began to feel compassion rather than hostility. Private Alan Morrow, a young soldier from Texas, later wrote in a letter to his family, I didn't expect to feel sorry for them. We were told that these women were the same ones who helped kill our boys. But when I saw them sitting there, holding bowls of ice cream like it was a gift from God, I couldn't help but think that maybe we had all been caught in something much bigger than we understood. Meanwhile, the women themselves began to process their unexpected freedom. As much as they had been trained to fight to the death for the emperor, the realization that they were alive and cared for, was both a relief and a burden. They had spent months in the most difficult conditions, constantly fearing capture, knowing their fate would be grim if they were ever caught. Now, in these unfamiliar surroundings, they had no choice but to confront the reality that they had survived not only their own defeat, but also the expectations of their war-torn society. The days at the Okinawa detention camp became a strange sort of limbo. The women began to interact with the American soldiers, sharing small moments of laughter, trading stories, and even helping with tasks around the camp. The barriers that separated them, language, culture, and wartime hatred, slowly began to crumble. These were not the faceless enemies they had been taught to despise, but human beings with their own dreams, fears, and regrets. But even as the ice cream melted in their mouths and the days stretched on in peace, the women couldn't escape the weight of their past actions. Many of them had seen the horrors of war firsthand, both as soldiers and as civilians. They had been part of the machinery of a regime that had unleashed untold suffering on millions. No amount of ice cream could erase that. No amount of kindness could undo the guilt they carried in the months that followed. The women of the Okinawa camp were slowly integrated into the broader post-war efforts to rebuild Japan. Some were repatriated to their homes. Others remained in U.S. custody, working in clerical roles, assisting with translation, or helping to rebuild the shattered cities. They would spend the rest of their lives haunted by the war, by the actions they had taken, by the choices they had made. But for that brief, strange moment in Okinawa, the women had been granted a fleeting taste of humanity, a taste they never expected to find in the aftermath of war. The ice cream, and the kindness that came with it, would remain one of the most profound paradoxes of their captivity. To them, it was a reminder that even in the most unimaginable circumstances, the capacity for mercy could flourish in the years following their time in the American detention camps. The women who had been captured in the final days of the war would grapple with the memories of their captivity, as well as the haunting sense of dislocation that followed them long after the ice cream had melted. They returned to a Japan in ruins, destroyed cities, burned fields, and a shattered nation left to rebuild under the watchful eyes of the occupying forces. For many, the transition from a life steeped in military discipline to one of survival in the ruins of defeat proved far more difficult than they could have imagined. Those who were repatriated to their homes were often met with cold, judgmental stares. In post-war Japan, the distinction between the guilty and the innocent was blurred. Most of these women had not fought on the front lines, but as members of auxiliary military units, they had still been part of the war machine. The Japanese public, exhausted and disillusioned, held little sympathy for those who had served the emperor's army, especially women. They were often seen not as victims of war, but as complicit in its horrors. The survivors found themselves isolated, unable to explain the strange mercy they had received in the camps. Many of them had not even told their families the full extent of their experiences. The shame of having been captured, the shame of surrender, was something that could not easily be discussed in a country that still viewed defeat as a stain on its honor. Some of the women were left to silently suffer in the quiet corners of their homes, while others tried to reintegrate into civilian life, finding jobs as secretaries, teachers, or nurses. But none of them were the same. For those who had spent time in the Okinawa camp, the memory of the ice cream remained vivid in their minds, an unspoken moment of human kindness that shattered their entire worldview. It was a betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. It was, in a sense, an affront to the very notion of war itself. How could the same hands that had destroyed their cities now offer them such tenderness? How could the same soldiers who had fought against their brothers and fathers now extend a gesture of peace so far removed from their expectations? And yet, it was that very act, the act of feeding them when they had expected punishment, that would shape their lives going forward. The women who had received ice cream in the camp found themselves struggling to reconcile the trauma of war with the unexpected humanity they had been shown. How could they process the kindness of strangers when they had spent their entire lives under the shadow of military training, which had taught them that kindness was weakness? In the years that followed, some of the women found peace in the most unexpected places. They became part of the post-war reconstruction efforts, working alongside former enemies, Americans, British, and others, in the rebuilding of Japan's infrastructure. They helped to heal the wounds left by the war, but they did so without ever fully understanding the depth of the mercy they had been given. In their hearts, they carried the memory of that day in Okinawa, the strange, absurd moment when they were handed ice cream instead of punishment. It would remain a symbol, a silent marker of the incredible transformation of the war's final moments in the decades that followed. As Japan evolved into an economic powerhouse and the scars of war began to fade, the women who had been captured found themselves in the shadows of history. Their stories, of surrender, of mercy, of the unexpected kindness that shattered their beliefs, were largely forgotten. The war became a distant memory for the nation, one buried beneath economic success and the rise of a new generation. But for the women who had been there, the memory of their time in the camps remained ever present. They passed it down to their children, not through words, but through the quiet lessons they had learned in the aftermath of their captivity. The lesson was not one of vengeance, nor of victory. It was a lesson in humility, in the recognition that even in the darkest of times, there is room for mercy and understanding. In the end, the story of the Japanese female POWs is not one of revenge, nor one of national pride. It is the story of how mercy can be a weapon in itself, how kindness can disrupt the fabric of war and make people question everything they thought they knew. It is the story of how, in the midst of defeat, the smallest acts of humanity can shift the balance of power inside the camp and in the hearts of those who survive. The women who had been offered ice cream in Okinawa would live the rest of their lives trying to understand what had happened in that moment, what it meant to be on the receiving end of mercy from those they had once been taught to hate. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not the victory of the Allies over Japan, but the victory of humanity over the darkness of war. The ice cream, simple, sweet, and cold, remained a reminder that even in the most brutal of conflicts, the smallest gestures of kindness could change the course of history. The years that followed the end of the war were filled with attempts at reconciliation, both personal and national. For the women who had been captured and held by the Allies, the post-war era was an uncomfortable journey. It was a time of rebuilding, of understanding the consequences of their actions, and of grappling with the profound shame they had been taught to associate with defeat. Yet, it was also a time where they began to acknowledge the mercy they had received in the camps. A mercy that contradicted everything they had known about warfare, honor, and survival. In post-war Japan, as the Allied occupation forces began to dismantle the militaristic systems that had driven the nation to war, the women who had served as part of the imperial military machinery found themselves at the intersection of personal shame and national renewal. They returned to homes and towns, to cities in rubble, where the memories of the war were still fresh, and the anger toward those who had participated in the conflict simmered just beneath the surface. But for the women who had been held as prisoners of war, the reality of post-war Japan was both a rebirth and a haunting. These women, once a part of the machine of war, now had to navigate a new world where the lines between victim and perpetrator had blurred. They were not the soldiers that the public expected them to be, yet they carried the weight of their past actions and the decisions they had made during the war. Some found jobs working as clerks, teachers, or nurses, roles that allowed them to quietly integrate into civilian life. But none of them could shake the memories of their time in the camps, those long days spent behind wire, where even in captivity, the enemy had shown them unexpected humanity. As the decades passed, some of the women began to speak more openly about their experiences in the camps. These stories were not of great heroism or victory, but of survival, of mercy, and of the shocking realization that their captors had treated them with kindness when they had expected punishment. The psychological toll of these years of captivity was heavy. The dissonance between the cruelty of war and the unexpected compassion shown to them was something they carried for the rest of their lives. The memory of the ice cream was a powerful symbol for many of these women. It was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was a moment that represented everything they had been taught to fear and hate. To receive something so simple, so humane, from their captors was an act that shook their entire worldview. For years, they had been indoctrinated to see the Americans as brutal enemies, as the enemy that had to be destroyed at all costs. Yet, here they were, receiving something as innocuous as ice cream, a gift from those they had once been taught to despise. And as much as the women tried to bury the memory of their time in captivity, it lingered. Some of them went on to raise families, to live lives that seemed on the surface to be the very opposite of their wartime roles. They married, had children, and began to rebuild their lives in the midst of a nation that was trying to redefine itself. Yet many of them struggled with the ghosts of their past, the shame of having been prisoners of war, the trauma of what they had witnessed during the war, and the surreal kindness they had experienced in captivity never fully left them. Some of the women found comfort in the relationships they built with fellow survivors. They formed quiet, unspoken bonds with one another, bonds that were forged not through shared glory, but through shared suffering. They knew better than anyone the complex nature of what it meant to survive such a war, to carry the weight of their own involvement, and to come face to face with the mercy shown to them by those they had once viewed as enemies. As time passed, Japan began to rise from the ashes of its defeat. The country transformed, politically and economically, and with that transformation came a growing sense of national pride. However, for the women who had been prisoners of war, there was a lingering silence, a silence born of the complexities of their experiences. The nation had moved on, but they had not. They had been part of a system that had led to the destruction of their country and the death of millions. Yet they had also been victims of that same system, caught in a web of loyalty, obedience, and fear. The memory of the ice cream remained, not as a reminder of weakness, but as a reminder of the deep humanity that can exist even in the darkest of times. The women who had received it would never forget the strange, surreal moment when they had been given something so simple, so human, after years of war, suffering, and fear. They would never forget how it felt to be treated with kindness when they had expected nothing but punishment. It was a moment that would change them forever. In the decades after the war, when some of the women finally spoke publicly about their experiences, they shared not only the story of the ice cream but also the emotional weight of being caught between two worlds, the world of the empire they had served and the world they had been forced to confront after the war. The ice cream became a symbol of the dissonance between the two, of the fractured identities they carried as they moved forward into a world that had radically changed. And perhaps, in the end, that was the real lesson of the ice cream, a lesson not about the kindness of the victors, but about the complexity of human nature. In the midst of a war that had dehumanized so many, a small act of kindness had the power to challenge everything these women had believed. And in that moment, they had been forced to confront not only the reality of their defeat, but also the humanity of those who had defeated them. The war had ended, but for the women who had been POWs, the journey was just beginning. They would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the strange mercy they had been shown, the paradox of kindness in a world consumed by violence, and the unspoken burden of survival. Their stories would remain a testament to the complex nature of war, to the enduring power of mercy, and to the simple truth that even in the darkest times, humanity can still find a way to shine through.